want to give you a little snippet about what I do. Well, first of all, I talk about baseball, but you don't have to love baseball to love my talk. And so that's one of the things that is very important. And, I tell a lot of stories, and I used to be assistant director of public relations with the Kansas City Royals, right? You know who that is, right?
All right.
Go Royals.
Woo!
And I would speak for a lot of Rotary and things like that, Optimus, those kind of clubs, right? Kiwanis. And so I had a little thing that I would always start off with, and it always worked. And I would come out and say, I've got some good news and some bad news. So let me give you the bad news first. Then I go through and tell them that ticket prices have gone up by $1 in all locations. I go to reserve seats, box seats, and I end up with the upper deck and general admission. And guess what? Even parking had went up by $1, and people were pretty upset. Now, nowadays, it doesn't go up by $1. It's more like $10, $15. So you'd think they were upset then. So anyway, I give them the bad news about the price increase going up $1 all around the stadium. And then I give them the good news. The good news is that hot dogs are still $6 each. So I'll talk about a few things like that. I'll maybe tell a few Royal stories. Most people know me as being a person who talks about the Negro baseball leagues and how important it was to the state of Kansas and to the world. And sometimes I like to talk about some of the baseball players I've met and some of the stories they tell me. So I'll tell one about James Cool Papa Bale. I don't know if you ever heard of him. I met him when I was about 22 in St. Louis, Missouri. He was an old guy, and I went and I talked to him because I had heard that he was the fastest baseball player that ever lived. And so I asked him one day, I said, is it true what they say about you? I heard that Satchel Paige said you were so fast you could turn the lights off and get in the bed before the room got dark. And he said, that's a true story. He said, but let me tell you the story. And he went on to tell me that they used to stay in some of the hotels. They weren't the nicest hotels in town. And Satchel used to like to go out and carouse around a little bit. So he was a married guy, and he's kind of stayed to the room. And so he noticed one night he was going to turn off the lights. There was a delay in the light, and then it went off. So he decided that he'd make some money on Satchel Paige. So Satchel Paige comes back to the room. He said, I bet you $5 I can turn the light off and get in the bed before the room got dark. So Satchel said, I've never seen anything like that. You're on. So he bet him $5. He turned off the light, got in the bed, and Satchel told the story for the next 50 years. So that's one of the great stories. And Cool Papa had some stories that you couldn't hardly believe that these things really existed. And he told me a story. He said, have you ever seen a man steal second base in the same inning twice and only come to bat one time? I said, no. I said, how can that be? He said, I'll tell you how it was. He said, we were playing a game, and I was on first base. He said, and someone hit the ball. He said, but I was going to steal. And so he said, anyway, I ran down and stole the base, but I thought they had hit the ball, but they really hadn't. So I jogged back to first base, and everybody was so surprised, nobody made a play. And his coach said, what are you doing back here? He said, wasn't it a foul ball? He said, no, you had the base stolen. He said, don't worry, I will steal it again. He stole the base a second time, stole second base twice, only came to bat once. Now I said, that's got to be a tall tale. But in the late 1980s, I was watching baseball. It used to be called Baseball Today. And they showed a play with the Toronto Blue Jays, and a guy named Jesse Barfield in the outfield did the same exact play and stole second base twice in the same inning. So I know that it was true. It wasn't such a tale, but that's the kind of stories that I heard. And then the last one I'll tell you tonight is that I fell in love with baseball, because I collected baseball cards. But the first baseball story I ever heard, I was in the third grade. And in our reader, they had a story about Babe Ruth. Now, in the third grade, I didn't know anything about baseball. If you asked me what's a 300 hitter, I didn't know if that was any good. If you asked me if 714 home runs was Ruth hit, is that any good? I couldn't have told you, because I didn't really know anything about baseball because no one had taught me at that time. But in the story, they said that Babe Ruth ate 21 hot dogs between a doubleheader. I knew what a hot dog was, and ever since then I've been telling stories. So come out tomorrow and I'll tell you some more stories, all right?
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be back in Downs. This is the third time I've been invited to present here, and I'm so honored, and it's just a highlight of my year, knowing that I think I was contacted back in the fall to come here, and I'm like, yes, so great to be here. I have a question for you. Do you feel like being tucked in bed tonight with a fairy tale? How long has it been since you've been tucked in bed with a fairy tale? And I know a lot of storytellers share personal stories. My life is so boring. I'm so normal. At least I think I am. My neighbors are pretty boring. And I thought, I have to tell a fairy tale. But I can connect it with real life. How many of you, when you were young or maybe still to this very day, celebrate May Day? May Day? Yeah, some hands are going up. Okay. Oh, Phil, where are you, Phil? Where's Phil? Phil, last time I checked, Royals lead 4-1 against the Orioles. Okay, back to the fairy tale. So when I was a little girl, my mother just loved being part of the community and showing her love not only for her family, but for our neighbors. So she taught us very young that on May 1st, we were going to deliver homemade May baskets to the neighbors. And in case you're not familiar with this tradition, you can make this cute little basket, store-bought, or we would use the little nut cups and fill them with treats and just wrap them in a piece of Kleenex and tie a ribbon around them. But the neat part about delivering these May baskets is the giver, you take it to whoever you want to give a May basket to, and you put it on their doorstep, and you ring the bell, and that person will come and answer the door and see the May basket, and then they, the receiver, have to chase you and catch you and then give you a kiss. So here I am in the first grade, and I am so in love with Tony Swinghammer. It was his real, you think Joe Ho is a strange name, Tony Swinghammer. Anyway, I grew up in this little town, New Rockford, North Dakota, and we celebrated May Day. The whole town did. And so I get my May basket ready for Tony, and I take it over, and his mom knew I was coming with it, and I ring the doorbell, and she's got him right there, and he sees the basket, and I'm like, okay, here I go. I'm running. He would not chase me. I said, well, if you're not going to chase me, Tony Swinghammer, I'm chasing you. That boy took off, but my feet took off, and I caught him. And his mother, thanks to his mother, she helped pin him to the ground. And I got to kiss Tony Swinghammer. I found out years later, we moved away to another town, but I found out years later he became a doctor. And I thought, oh, I think I'm still in love with Tony Swinghammer. But the fairy tale I found connects beautifully with this May Day celebration, because when we moved to the new town, Rugby, North Dakota, no one had celebrated it the way we did. So our family brought the tradition of dropping May baskets off at our neighbors and friends in this new town. So here's the fairy tale that you get to be tucked into bed tonight with. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived a farmer. His name was Baldric Macklin. He had a wife and 2 children, and they lived just on the outskirts of a very bustling and prosperous kingdom. Baldric was a farmer. He grew beans and wheat and barley. His wife was a seamstress. She made clothes for all the villagers. In the summer, the warm months, Baldric was very attentive to his fields of rice and beans and barley. But in the spring, he devoted all of his time to a single rose bush. For once a year, on May 1st, the rose bush gave one blossom, a beautiful white rose. His daughter, Gretchen, would say, "Oh, Father, that rose, it is the most perfect rose. It shines like the sunshine on the snow, and it is soft as a swan's down. Father, you grow the perfect rose. You are like a master gardener." And of course, Baldric felt embarrassed. "I'm not a master gardener. I'm just a farmer." Well, word traveled all over the kingdom about this rose bush that belonged to Baldric Macklin. It's hard to say that all in one breath. And the king and queen found out, and they decided they wanted to see this beautiful rose. So they sent a sealed letter to the home. And when it was read, "Hear ye, hear ye. Their royal highnesses, the king and queen, invite you, Baldric Macklin, and your family to the May Day celebration, and bring this beautiful rose that everyone speaks of so we can all enjoy its beauty." Oh, Baldric, he began to think, perhaps this is now my chance to become a master gardener for the king. And from that moment on, that early day in April when that letter arrived, that is all Baldric did, was attend to the rose bush. And his wife began to make new clothes. "Oh, we can't go to a celebration for a king and a queen without brand new clothes to wear." 2 days before May 1st, Baldric came into the house, and he said to his family, "I'm a wee bit worried. Usually by now, the rose has started to open, but it hasn't. Well, you best stay by that rose bush and find out what's going on with it, dear," said his wife. So that night, Baldric went out and he stood by his rose bush. But when he walked towards it, he immediately knew what was going on. There, standing by the rose bush, was a stranger, a beggar, touching the rose. "You, get away! You beggar, get away from that! That rose, it's precious. Don't touch it. Have you no consideration? Have you no feelings? Now away with you, shoo!" And as the beggar turned, he looked at Baldric and said, "I just wanted to go away." And as the beggar turned to leave, a single tear fell from his eye and fell upon the unopened bud. Well, that explains it. Why, the bud wouldn't open. It was afraid. It was afraid to open. That beggar standing there staring at it. Well, one day before the festival, Baldric came back into his house and he said, I'm a wee bit worried. The bud still hasn't opened. I sent the beggar away, but, well, it still hasn't opened. And his daughter said, Father, maybe it's just a wee bit thirsty. Give it a drink. And his wife said, perhaps it's a wee bit chilly. Put your cloak on it too. And he did. He watered it. He put his cloak on it. The day of the festival, May 1st, arrived. Family, heaven's sake, the bud won't open. And his son, Jacob, said, Father, perhaps the rose bush is lonely. You should bring it in. And Baldric looked at his son and said, a plant? A plant? It gets lonely? That's the silliest thing I've heard. A plant doesn't have feelings. No more than a rock has feelings. No more than a scraggly beggar has feelings. And he looked at his wife and said, put a pot of stew on. I'll be back. And he went out and he searched for the beggar. He searched and he searched and he finally found him. And he stretched out his hand and he said, Friend, come with me. My wife has dinner ready for us. And they brought the beggar into their home. And he sat down by the warm fire and had stew. And his wife said, Well, you two, look, I've got clean clothes for the both of you. And well, Baldric knew that night when they went to the May Day festival at the palace, the king would be very disappointed in him. The rosebud, it still hasn't opened. And his wife said, You did your best, but you've actually been doing better things. Baldric and his family went to the festival, and the king, when they saw the family arrive, announced to everyone, this is the man that grows this famous rose. Bring it forth so we can all see its beauty. And Baldric hung his head in shame. It would not open. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But then another voice was heard. It was the stranger holding the rosebud in his hand. Baldric has been doing other things other than tending to this rose. For you see, in my travels, said the beggar stranger, many saw me, but no one offered to help me. But Baldric did. And well, tears of joy fell from the stranger's eyes and fell upon the rose, and it blossomed like a brilliant light right there in the castle. And the fragrance of this single rose filled up the room like it was 1,000 roses. And the stranger looked at Baldric and said, You have discovered, my friend, that a person is more important than praise. And that is the story I tuck you into bed with. Happy May Day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I love Downs. I've had the most wonderful time here, and this is a fabulous festival. Thank you. So now, as you can tell from my voice, I'm not from around these parts. In fact, all my grandparents were born in Ireland, and so I told some people this afternoon, but I have enough Irish in me to get an Irish passport. And so I like to think of myself as an English woman. Well, really, no. I like to think of myself as an Irish peasant woman with a very thin veneer of English respectability. Very thin at times. I'm staying with Eleanor, and she will tell you how thin that respectability can get. So, but I am now an American citizen. I became an American citizen almost 10 years ago, and truly it was one of the best days of my life. But I grew up in England, and my education up till high school was in England. And when I was in the last few weeks of high school, my speech and drama teacher, my favorite teacher, she said to me, "Geraldine, you are very talented, but you won't make ever, I don't believe, a great dramatic actress. No, I believe you will find your niche in the BBC, in the British Broadcasting Corporation." Well, Mrs. Blythe, as I said, was my favorite teacher at Paul's Convent, the convent boarding school I went to from the age of 11 to 16. And I took every class from her that I possibly could. I did speech festivals, I did speech exams, I did plays. I was the lion in Androcles and the lion. Grrr, 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 grrr. What did she mean I wouldn't make a great dramatic actress? But she spoke those words to me just before I left the school, and so I really took them to heart. And I thought, okay, I'm going to work for the BBC. Now, I knew it was very difficult to get into the BBC on any level at all. But with my usual enormous enthusiasm, I decided I wasn't just going to work for the BBC. Oh, no. I was going to be the head of the prestigious drama department of the BBC. I just knew it. Well, I kept that vision ever before me as I went to college, I went to university, and then I did a stage management course. And it came to the summer before I was going to apply when I got a break. Now, my parents had moved to Spain, which sounds very exotic, but if you remember, we were in England. And so it's only a 2.5-hour plane little jump. So it's really like if you're on the East Coast retiring to Florida. So I was going to see them. And sitting next to me on the plane was this lovely man with a bushy beard. He was about 35. He had kind eyes. He was married, and his name was Danny. And I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a cameraman in the drama department of the BBC." I said, "Ooh, I want to work for the BBC." He said, "You know, it's very difficult to get in." I said, "I know. Do you have any tips?" He said, "Well, talking to you, I think probably the best thing for you would be get a temporary contract. And there's one that would suit you. It's called a temporary relief floor assistant. It's the lowest form of life on the studio floor. But if you get it, it'll be a foot in the door, and then you'll be on your way." He said, "But they are very, very hard to get." And then he said, "All right, I'll help you." And he took out his card, and every word of this is true. My stories are true. So he took out his card, and he wrote a name on the back. And he said, "When you get back to England, phone up this man and tell him that I said you had to have an interview, and he'll give it to you. And if he likes you, he'll make sure that you get the real interview, which is the committee interview. And if he likes you, he'll make sure you get the job." I said, "Thank you. Thank you so much, thank you." He said, "Just a minute." He said, "There's something you need to know." He said, "This man really likes women." Now, you've got to remember, I was in my early 20s and even more gorgeous than I am now, if that were possible. He said, "And he really likes young women, and I think he'd particularly like you. But don't play that game, okay? Don't play that card, don't play it." And I thought to myself, play that card? Play that card? What does he mean, play that card? I mean, I knew what Mrs. Blythe had said. I wasn't going to have to play any card. I was going to succeed on sheer professionalism alone. I just knew it. But I didn't say that to him. I just took the card and thanked him. And when I got back to England, I took it out and looked at it. Mr. Ramsbottom. We have some very unusual names in England. So I phoned up Mr. Ramsbottom, and I got an interview, and oh, I was so excited. But even though I knew what Mrs. Blythe had said, I was still a little bit nervous. And so I did what any self-respecting woman here would have done in the same situation. I went out and bought myself a new outfit. I went to an upmarket but rather fashionable department store because I wanted to strike the right balance. I wanted to be a mixture of practical but trendy. And I found the perfect thing. I found a little tweed green and burgundy skirt, a little matching shirt, a little crossover sweater. But the piece de resistance that put me at the edge of 1980s fashion was a pair of bright green Mary Quant hose. Oh, they were gorgeous, gorgeous. Oh. Now, I bought 2 pairs just to be sensible, and I tried one on where they fit perfectly, ran all over town in them, got lots of admiring glances, and then I got a run. Now, this wasn't any ordinary run, no. This run was the size of the Trans-Siberian Railway. But it didn't matter because I had that other pair. Well, the day of the interview came, I was pottering around, I was half-dressed when I looked at the clock and I realized I'd mistimed it. I had to get out of the apartment, the flat now, to get on the tube to get to the BBC. Well, all I had to do was to put on those hose. So I got the packet, opened it, got out the hose, started to put them on, when I realized this pair was faulty. The crotch only came up to the knees. But what could I do? They matched the outfit. So I hobbled out of there and I got on the tube. I got to the BBC. I sat in the foyer. Mr. Ramsbottom himself came to get me because his secretary was sick that day. And he motioned for me to follow him. And I did my very best. But it's very hard to keep up with a man who walks very fast. When you're shackled around the knees by a pair of bright green hose. And I thought, this is my dream job. This dream job interview is fast becoming an audition for March of the Penguins. Well, the spoken part of the interview did go well, and then Mr. Ramsbottom said, Geraldine, he said, I'd like to take you around the studios, show you around the studios. And I said, oh, thank you so much, Mr. Ramsbottom. That would be absolutely lovely, thank you. Well, the BBC studios in those days were littered with great piles of wood and great coils of wire. And I did my best to get over them. But we came to a particularly large pile of wood. And Mr. Ramsbottom looked at the wood, and he looked at me, and he said, he put out his hand, and he said, I think perhaps you need some help. And I looked at his hand, and I thought, could I? Should I? And I'm afraid I did. I took hold of his hand, and I looked deep into his eyes as I got my legs over that pile of wood. And then I carried on holding his hand and carried on looking into his eyes for just a moment longer than I should have done. I was a hussy. A brazen hussy. Well, as soon as that interview was over, I hobbled out of there as fast as I possibly could. But Mr. Ramsbottom came through. I was invited to the committee interview, and they told me they'd let me have the results by mail, by snail mail, of course. So every morning, as soon as I heard the plop of the mail on the mat, I was out there. But there was nothing there the first week, nothing the second, nothing the third. But on the fourth week, there it was, on the mat, a letter from the British Broadcasting Corporation. Oh, I picked it up. It was very light. Was this a good thing? Was this a bad thing? I put it up to the window. It was no use. I couldn't see through it. I was going to have to open it. I slit it open and my hands were shaking. I got it out. I noticed my palms were sweating just a little bit. And it said, "Dear Miss Buckley, we are delighted to be able to offer you a temporary..." Yes, I'd done it. I'd got into the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. Fame and fortune, here I come. I was on my way to the top. Yes. The only thing is, after getting the job, I then had to do it. And it became quite apparent to me after just a few weeks that perhaps I wasn't best suited to work behind the scenes at the British Broadcasting Corporation. And I had lots of time to think about it, lots of time, because I spent most of my time, in fact almost all of my time, standing around with a clipboard not doing anything. And so that information went from my head to my heart. And that's when I realized that although Mrs. Blythe had been so well-meaning, she hadn't got it right. I wasn't destined to work behind the scenes at the BBC. And that's when I also realized that we can't follow somebody else's dream for our life. Of course, we should take advice, but we have to discover what we were created to do and then go and do that. And so at the end of the 3 months, I didn't renew my contract, but I came over here to America. I came on to the next adventure. And I look forward to telling you more about those adventures, all true, tomorrow. Thank you so much. Bless you all. Thank you.
Don't scare me like that. I thought we were in New Jersey for a minute. I suppose you can tell from our accents that Geraldine and I are from the same part of the country. We go way back, don't we, darling? We do. We don't need a translator, and that's amazing in its own right. I'll start you out with more information probably than you require. I was conceived in North Carolina and born in Tennessee. So I'm bilingual. One of the neat things about growing up in the eastern part of Tennessee is that's the home of the Tennessee Valley Authority. You've probably heard of that. You own it. It's owned by the federal government. It was started by Mr. Roosevelt, the second one. That Franklin guy started that back during the Depression. There are 52 dams in the TVA system. That's a lot of backed up water. We've been backed up since the Depression. But one of the first books that I read was Huckleberry Finn. My mother gave me that book, and I was just enamored by boats and rivers and bodies of water like that. And then the second book I read was 2 Years Before the Mast. And then I read Moby Dick, and then I was hooked on sailing, so I decided I needed to build me a sailboat to sail on the TVA lakes. And I saved up my money and I bought a 12-foot wooden John boat. And I needed a mast. And I went to my uncle's farm and got a red oak tongue off a wagon 12 feet long and mounted that on my boat and pushed it out in the water, and it went Two things happened to me at the same time. One of the worst things that ever happened to me, and one of the best things. I got sent to New Jersey. I'll let you decide which part that is. The other part was my wife and I had been there a little while, and the spring was coming up, and everybody there said to us, "You going down the shore?" And we said, "What?" And they said, "Are you going down the shore?" And I said, "I don't know what that is." And I finally figured out what they were saying was, "Are you going to the beach?" And we said, well, yeah, sure, we'll go to the beach. So we went down to the beach and we saw all these sailboats sailing up and down Barnegat Bay. And we said, boy, that looks like fun. And I said, yeah, and they're not falling over, you know. So I said, you know, we were living on a little lake. This is the biggest lake in the state of New Jersey is Lake Apatcon. It's 6 miles long. The smallest lake in Tennessee is 40 miles long. You know, I mean, it don't take much water to impress people in New Jersey, I'll tell you. But on the way home, we stopped at a sailboat dealer just to sort of look at them, you know, and they had those little sunfish, little 12-foot plank, you know, and I said, we could strap a cooler on it right here. You could sit over here. I could sit over here. We could have a lot of fun on it. Well, let's consider it. It was $322, and we got home, and I told my wife, I'm going to run down to the lake to the sailboat dealer down there and just see if they've got anything cheaper. To make a long story short, we bought a boat that you could sleep in that night. And that started it. We became sailors, and we sailed around on that little lake in New Jersey, and then we pulled that boat back to East Tennessee, and we put it on the TVA lakes, and we sailed there for a while, and then we traded it for a bigger boat. And then, after sailing for about 8 years, we bought us a boat. We bought a 32-foot Bristol sailboat and went on the ocean. And we sailed all over the Caribbean and lived aboard for 2 years, and up and down the Chesapeake, and had some of the most wonderful and the most horrific days of our lives. If you were to ask me, what's it like owning a sailboat, I think probably the best description I could give you would be stand in a cold shower and tear up $100 bills. A lot of $100 bills. But we had some wonderful times, and we did get to meet a lot of wonderful people. And one of the people that we met just stuck with me for a long time, and I've told this story all over the country, but we were in the Abacos. Now, some of you may know where the Abacos are. The Abacos are the northeastern part of the Bahamas. Depending on how big a rock you call an island, there are 880 islands in the Bahamas, and the northeastern part is kind of unique in that the Abacos, as that part of the Bahamas is known, are unique in that almost all the people who live there, all the natives who live there, are Anglo. They're white people, which is unusual because, as you know, most Bahamians are black. And the way that those white people got there is those are the descendants of the British expatriates. In other words, the people in New England who were still loyal to the king after the American Revolution. They were living like in Massachusetts and New Jersey, you know. They were living up there, and then when their side lost the revolution, they moved to the Bahamas. Makes you wonder who lost the war, don't it? Anyhow, there's this place over there now called American Harbor, and of course the reason they call it American Harbor is because so many people like my wife and myself hung out there. It's just a great place to anchor. It was really protected, and then there's a lot of other folks in there, and you could get together and have supper together. There's a lot of camaraderie, and then you could go out and sail during the day and come back and be safe there at night. Now, the deal is you wanted to be in there before dark because it was pretty spooky out there. In the water, they've got these things called coral heads. Coral heads are, you know, this is the only place in the world I've ever seen rock fence posts. They're a lot like that. You know how you don't want to run into one of them? You don't want to run into a coral head with your boat. It's hard as Chinese arithmetic. You don't want to hit that, you know. Anyhow, one evening, I'd been sitting there in the cockpit of the boat, and my wife and I had had supper, and I had the dishpan up in the cockpit, and I was washing the dishes and just watching the sunset. and I heard thunk, 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 little one-lung diesel coming through the cut, and it was getting dark, and I thought, boy, somebody's out kind of late. This ain't good. But he made it through the cut and came on in, and as he came by, I was just admiring his boat. It was a little about 30-foot wooden cutter, just a beautiful little sailboat, and he was pulling his dinghy along behind him, and as he went by, I threw up my hand, he threw up his hand, and I watched as he went by, and I looked at the transom of his boat, and the name on the transom of his boat was Air Shaft. And I'm thinking, air shaft, I've heard of that. Where have I heard that term? And then it occurred to me, over there in the part of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia and up and down through there where they mine coal. Now, most of the time your coal seam is right like that through a mountain. They'll dig a mine shaft right down into the mountain like that, but the further back they go, of course, they need air. So they drill a hole right from up here down to the mine shaft, and that's called an air shaft. And I'm thinking, surely to goodness, that ain't the same thing. As he went by, I thought, where's this boy from? I grabbed my binoculars as he was going away in that dim light, and I tuned them in, and right under air shaft it said Ashland, Kentucky. And I thought, I got to talk to that boy. We won't need a translator, you know. Ashland, Kentucky, and the reason I wanted to talk to him was because on the stern of my boat it said Friendsville, Tennessee. Now, Ashland, Kentucky, yep, you can get to there from Ashland, Kentucky, because Ashland, Kentucky's on the Ohio River. And I'm thinking, this old boy has come down the Ohio River and got to there because I had left Tennessee and got there the same way, see? And I thought, I got to talk to that fella. So the next morning at breakfast, I got in my dinghy and rode down there to where he was anchored, knocked on the hull, and he said, whoever you are, come on aboard, I've got coffee made. So I grabbed hold of a cleat and I climbed aboard, tied my dinghy off, plopped myself down in the cockpit, and this old cracked, heavy, white coffee mug came steaming up out of the companionway, and I grabbed it and got me a slug of it. And that old boy climbed up and sat down across from me, and he told me his story. And being a songwriter, I stole it and gave it a little twist. There's a small house in Kentucky, in a quiet little place, just outside of Pikeville in the east part of the state, and 4 creek bottom acres that just sit there and wait for Daddy's plow. But that plow, it left the county in the back end of a truck when Daddy sold the home place and all his farming stuff. He bid his neighbors all goodbye, and they all wished him good luck. He never made a living farming. Dad worked in the mines. He drove every day to mate one across the West Virginia line. And he always raised tobacco. The money came in time for Santa Claus. Well, Daddy hated coal dust, and he made himself a vow that one day he'd give up digging below and above ground. Well, that day finally came. He left that East Kentucky town. Daddy built a sailboat from the timber off our land. It took him 20-some odd years. He made every piece by hand. And then he trucked it down to Norfolk and put it in the sea. Now that East Kentucky miner's gone to where there ain't no dust to breathe. We got a card last Christmas from a place called Matlow Key, somewhere in the Abacos, wherever that might be. Said he was headed for St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. I think that's Russia. Well, I don't know when we'll see him, but if we never do, I'm just glad that he lived long enough to see his dream come true. He taught us that hard work pays off and that dreams can pay off too. Daddy built a sailboat from the timber off our land. It took him 20 some odd years. He made every piece by hand, and then he trucked it down to Norfolk and put it in the sea. Now that East Kentucky miner's gone to where there ain't no dust to breathe.